I still remember the exact words because some sentences never really leave you. "Are you deaf, Collins?" I said, "Clear the runway." Funny thing is, after 32 years in an airport tower, I'd been called just about everything except lucky. And that Christmas Eve, I wasn't about to start being lucky. Outside the glass walls of the control tower, the wind pushed thick snow sideways across the floodlights while families crowded every gate below. Kids wrapped in oversized winter coats hugging stuffed animals, parents checking their watches every 30 seconds, everyone convinced that home was only one flight away. Inside the tower, though, it felt like the whole world had narrowed down to one radar screen, one runway, and one decision that nobody else wanted to make. My name is Owen Collins. By then, I was 63 years old enough that the younger controllers joked I probably remembered when airplanes still had propellers. They weren't trying to be mean. That's just how airports work. You tease the old guy until the weather turns ugly. Then suddenly everyone wants to know what the old guy thinks. I'd never been the smartest controller in the building, and I definitely wasn't the fastest anymore. But I'd survived 3 decades because I trusted patterns more than opinions. Weather lies sometimes. Forecasts lie even more. Numbers don't. That's something I learned the hard way. Standing across the room was our operations director, Ryan Mercer. Expensive suit, polished shoes that had probably never touched snow, phone glued to his hand because corporate headquarters had been calling every 15 minutes asking why our departure board was turning red. Delays cost money. Cancellations cost bonuses. Christmas delays could cost careers. Ryan understood spreadsheets. I understood airplanes. Unfortunately for both of us, those are two completely different languages. "The forecast is clear," he snapped, pointing toward the giant weather display like it was evidence in a courtroom. "Surface temperature is within limits. Visibility is acceptable. We've got 1018 passengers waiting on flight 782 and another 200 behind them. Open the runway." I didn't even look at him. My eyes stayed on the live surface sensors blinking along the runway edge. The numbers weren't dramatic. That was exactly what bothered me. A tiny temperature drop. Humidity climbing just enough. Wind shifting by only a few degrees. Separately, they meant almost nothing. Together, they told a story I'd seen once before, a story that never ended well. "The runway is starting to glaze," I said quietly. "Give it 10 more minutes." Ryan laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh someone makes because something is funny. It was the laugh people use when they think you're embarrassing them. 10 minutes? You've already delayed them 25. You know what they're saying downstairs? They're saying some old controller is afraid of snow. A couple of younger controllers glanced at me before looking back at their screens. Nobody wanted to get involved. Airports have their own politics. You learn to stay invisible when management starts looking for someone to blame. Then the radio crackled. "Tower. This is Horizon 782. Passengers are seated. De-icing complete. Ready for departure." I recognized the captain immediately. Emily Carter. We'd worked together for years. Calm voice. Excellent pilot. The kind who never rushed anyone. "Tower," she added a second later. "We've got a cabin full of families trying to make Christmas dinner. Any update?" I closed my eyes for half a second. Nobody in that cockpit knew what I was seeing. Nobody downstairs could see the invisible layer beginning to form across sections of pavement. Ice doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It waits until you're already moving too fast to stop. Ryan stepped closer until I could smell his expensive cologne. "Clear them, Todegger to pollution." Chase tightened. "No." His face tightened. "Do you have any idea how much this delay is costing?" I finally turned toward him. "Do you have any idea what one accident costs?" The room went completely silent. Even the radios seemed quieter somehow. Ryan shook his head slowly like a disappointed teacher looking at a stubborn student. "You're a relic, Owen. You sit up here staring at screens pretending you're the only person who knows how weather works. This airport doesn't belong to you." I almost smiled because I'd heard versions of that speech before. Every few years, somebody younger arrived convinced experience was just another word for being outdated. They always believed technology had replaced instinct. They always believed computers eliminated human judgment. Most of them eventually learned otherwise. Some learned the easy way. Others didn't. My fingers drifted toward the old brass stopwatch sitting beside my keyboard. It hadn't worked perfectly in years, but I kept winding it every morning anyway. It had belonged to my son, Caleb. 8 Christmases earlier, he'd bought it at a flea market because he thought it looked like something pilots carried during World War II. He'd laughed and said, "Dad, one day when you finally retire, You'll probably still be timing airplanes with this thing instead of your fancy computers. I laughed with him that day. 3 months later, Caleb boarded a commuter flight during an early spring storm. Another control tower. Another supervisor under pressure. Another decision made 10 seconds too quickly. There wasn't much left to bury. Ever since then, I'd promised myself one thing. I would never let anyone rush me into gambling with somebody else's family just because a schedule looked better on paper. The radio crackled again. Tower, Horizon 782 standing by. I reached for the microphone, took one slow breath, and prepared to answer, knowing that whatever happened next was going to change far more than one Christmas flight. I cannot clear you for departure. Hold position. The words left my mouth calmly, but they landed in the tower like someone had thrown a brick through a church window. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Ryan Mercer exploded. Absolutely not. He stormed across the room, snatched the secondary headset from an empty station, and glared at me like I'd personally declared war on Christmas. "Captain Carter," he said into the radio before I could stop him. "Stand by for revised instructions." Emily didn't answer immediately. She knew our voices. She knew something wasn't right. "Operations, with all due respect," she finally replied. "Tower has final authority. Is there a problem?" Ryan muted the microphone and rounded on me. "You are making this airport look incompetent." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my eyes on the surface sensor feed. The tiny fluctuations were becoming less subtle now. Moisture levels continued climbing. Wind shifted another degree. A strip near the departure threshold flashed amber before returning to green. Most people would have ignored it. I couldn't. "Ryan," I said quietly, "I'm asking for 10 minutes. And I'm telling you that your 10 minutes just cost us 3 more departures, 2 international connections, and probably tomorrow's headlines. Better tomorrow's headlines than tonight's memorial service." His jaw clenched. Around us, the younger controllers looked frozen. Nobody wanted to choose sides. One of them, a kid named Luis who'd been in the tower barely 2 years, slowly rolled his chair closer to my station. He lowered his voice so only I could hear. "Mr. Collins, are you seeing something I'm not?" I pointed toward the sensor grid without looking away. "Look at stations 12 through 17. Don't watch the colors. Watch the trend." He stared for several seconds. His eyebrows pulled together. "That's strange." "Exactly." Ryan overheard him and slammed his hand on my console. "Enough. Everybody back to work." Then he pulled out his phone and dialed someone. He didn't even bother walking away. "Security?" "Yeah. I need 2 officers in the tower." Several heads turned at once. Nobody had ever seen security called on an air traffic controller. Ryan ended the call and folded his arms. "You are no longer fit to make operational decisions." I let out a slow breath. "Because I disagree with you? Because you're emotionally compromised." That one hit harder than I expected. He knew about Caleb. Everyone in management did. They'd all attended the funeral 8 years earlier. Using my son against me was low, even for Ryan. "You still think every storm is the one that took your boy," he continued, his voice dropping just enough that it sounded almost sympathetic. "You need to admit that grief is making your decisions." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Grief doesn't change temperature readings." He had no reply to that. Instead, he reached for the override authorization binder kept inside the tower for emergency administrative actions. My stomach tightened. I never actually seen anyone use it. The manual allowed operations management to remove a controller under extraordinary circumstances, but only if another certified controller immediately assumed responsibility. Ryan flipped through the pages with shaking hands, signed his name, and pushed the binder toward Luis. "You're taking the position." Luis looked horrified. "Sir, that's an order." Every eye in the room shifted toward the young controller. He swallowed hard. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Collins trained me." Ryan snapped. "Exactly. Now prove you can think for yourself." I stood up before Luis had to answer. "It's all right, son." He looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. I remembered being his age. "You think every decision will define your career. You don't realize the hardest ones define your character instead." The tower door opened, and 2 airport police officers stepped inside. Both recognized me immediately. One of them, Officer Denise Harper, frowned. "What's going on?" Ryan answered before I could. "Mr. Collins has been relieved of duty." Denise looked from him to me. "Is that true?" I nodded once. "Apparently." She hesitated. "Oh, Win. It's okay." I picked up my coffee mug, reached automatically for Caleb's old brass stopwatch, then stopped halfway. I looked down at it sitting beside the keyboard. Tick, tick, tick. The little hand kept moving as steadily as ever. I left it exactly where it was. Something told me it still had one more job to do. Behind me, I heard Ryan speaking again. Captain Carter, Horizon 782. Cleared for immediate departure. My entire body stiffened. Emily's voice came back instantly. Tower, confirm that clearance. There was a pause. She knew something had changed. She couldn't quite explain why, but years of flying had taught her to trust instinct too. Ryan answered, confirmed. Winds within operational limits. You are cleared for takeoff. Before anyone else could speak, I turned around one last time. Emily. My voice echoed through the tower because nobody else was talking anymore. Ryan shouted, ignore him. I kept looking at the microphone. Trust your judgment. Silence. Then Emily answered with words I'd never forget. I always do. I didn't know exactly what she meant. Maybe she was talking to me. Maybe she was talking to herself. Maybe both. Officer Harper gently touched my elbow. Let's go. We started walking toward the tower door. Every step felt strangely slow, like time itself had thickened. Behind me, I could hear Ryan issuing departure instructions. Runway lights brightened. Ground crews cleared away from the taxiway. Somewhere below us, 118 passengers probably smiled as the engine spooled higher, believing the worst part of their night was finally over. We reached the hallway outside the control room when something made me stop. Not a sound, not a warning light, just silence. Airports are never truly quiet. There's always a rhythm. Engines, radios, vehicles. That rhythm disappeared for less than a heartbeat. And in that tiny gap, every instinct I had screamed the same thing. I turned back toward the tower windows just as the floodlights reflected up something racing across the pavement. It wasn't snow. Snow drifts slowly. This moved like liquid glass. A thin sheet of supercooled ice spread across the departure end of the runway so quickly it almost looked alive, swallowing black asphalt beneath the shimmering white skin from one edge to the other. Inside, the tower alarms erupted all at once. Every runway condition monitor flashed red. Controllers who had been sitting calmly seconds earlier shot to their feet. Louis stared at his screen in disbelief. Surface friction collapsing, someone yelled. Another controller shouted, crosswind spike. Ryan spun toward the displays, every bit of color draining from his face as line after line of live sensor data poured in, proving exactly what I'd been watching for the last half hour. Through the tower speakers, Emily's voice burst across the frequency, louder than I'd ever heard it. Tower, we aborted. We aborted. My heart stopped. Then she kept talking. We hadn't reached rotation speed yet. If we'd lifted 10 seconds later, her voice cracked before she finished, we would have lost the aircraft. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The only sounds inside the building were warning alarms and the ticking of a brass stopwatch still sitting on my empty desk upstairs, counting seconds that suddenly meant the difference between a delayed Christmas and a field full of wreckage. Ryan looked at me through the glass separating the hallway from the tower. For the first time since I'd met him, he wasn't angry. He wasn't confident. He wasn't a manager calculating losses or protecting his reputation. He was simply a man staring at the consequences of nearly making the worst decision of his life, realizing that every number he'd dismissed, every warning he'd mocked, every insult he'd thrown across that room had almost ended with 118 names on the evening news. The phone in his pocket started ringing. Then another phone rang. Then another. Corporate headquarters. Federal operations. Regional command. Everyone wanted answers. Ryan never reached for any of them. He just stood there looking at me, as if hoping I'd somehow tell him this had all been a misunderstanding. But there are moments in life when reality arrives all at once, and no explanation can soften its weight. That was one of them. Nobody spoke for what felt like an entire minute. The alarms eventually quieted down. The flashing lights settled into steady warning indicators. And outside the tower, the runway looked almost peaceful again, covered in a thin sheet of ice that reflected the floodlights like polished glass. It was almost cruel how beautiful it looked, because every person standing in that building now understood exactly what it really was. Officer Harper slowly removed her hand from my arm. Looks like you weren't going anywhere after all, she said softly. I managed a tired smile, but I couldn't find anything clever to say back. Ryan finally crossed the room toward me. The confident executive who had walked into the tower an hour earlier was gone. His tie hung loose. His face looked 10 years older, and his eyes never quite met mine. Owen, he started before stopping. Some apologies are too small for the damage they almost have to cover. He swallowed hard and tried again. I was wrong, I nodded once. Yeah, there wasn't any satisfaction in saying it. People imagine moments like that feel like winning. They don't. When someone almost gets 100 innocent people killed, being proven right doesn't feel like victory. It feels like relief mixed with exhaustion. Ryan looked toward the tower floor where controllers were already coordinating inspections, emergency crews, and delayed departures. Corporate's asking me what happened. Tell them the weather changed. He shook his head. That's not the whole truth. No, I said quietly. It isn't. Before either of us could continue, Captain Emily Carter came through the secured hallway still wearing her flight jacket. She walked straight toward me without saying a word, then wrapped both arms around me in the kind of hug that only happens after people realize how close they came to never seeing their families again. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were red. My first officer wanted to continue the takeoff, she admitted. He thought the vibration was just slush. I nodded. And you? She smiled weakly. I heard your voice in my head telling me never to rush a bad feeling just because everyone else is in a hurry. She laughed through tears. I probably annoyed you for years asking so many weather questions. You did, I admitted with a grin. Turns out it paid off. A little later, we watched through the terminal windows as passengers were escorted back inside. Most looked frustrated. A few complained. One father threw his hands into the air because his little girl was crying over missing Christmas morning with her grandparents. None of them knew they had just walked away from the worst day of their lives. And honestly, I hoped they never would. Sometimes the greatest thing you can give someone is a tragedy they never realize almost happened. By sunrise, the investigation had already begun. Every data log matched the sensor trend I had seen. Every recording confirmed the runway conditions deteriorated exactly when the models failed to predict it. The official report would eventually praise teamwork, procedures, and operational safety. Reports usually do. They rarely capture fear, instinct, or the weight of a decision that has to be made before the evidence becomes obvious. Ryan offered me my position back before noon. Higher salary, early retirement package, even a public recognition ceremony. I thanked him, then politely declined. 32 years was enough. I walked back into the tower one final time. Not to work, but to collect the few things that had lived on my desk longer than some employees had worked there. My coffee mug, a faded family photograph, and Caleb's old brass stopwatch. It was still ticking. I wound it gently, slipped it into my coat pocket, and stood for a moment looking across the same runway that had shaped so much of my life. 8 years earlier, I couldn't save my own son because somewhere another tower ignored the warning signs. That regret never disappeared. It probably never will. But grief has a strange way of changing shape. It stops being a weight you carry and slowly becomes a voice that reminds you who you refuse to become. As I reached the elevator, Ryan called out one last time, "Owen, if you hadn't stayed stubborn." I smiled without turning around. It wasn't stubborn. He waited. It was experience. The elevator doors closed before he answered. A week later, someone sent me a picture from Flight 782. The passengers had finally made it home the following morning. The children were smiling beside Christmas trees that were opened a day late. One little boy held a cardboard sign that read, "Best Christmas Ever." You would never know how close that sign came to never being made. And that's exactly how it should be. Heroes don't always wear uniforms, and they don't always make the evening news. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who refuse to ignore the quiet little voice earned through decades of mistakes, heartbreak, and hard lessons. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been standing in that tower, with hundreds of angry passengers waiting, executives demanding results, and only your instincts telling you something was wrong, would you have held that runway closed? Or would you have trusted the schedule and hoped for the best? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people. Some believe rules exist to be followed. Others believe experience matters more than pressure. I'd really like to hear which side you're on. And if this story made you think about the invisible decisions that quietly protect all of us every single day, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes doing the right thing is worth standing alone.